Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Diversity and Inclusion, the Least Expensive Formula to Multiply Profits. I am Alexandra Stevens, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Programs and Engagement at the Hyatt Career Center at Brandeis, and we're so happy to have you with us on this beautiful day in Waltham, and to have Cheryl Axelrod, class of 1990, on our call today as our presenter. Now, I just want to give you a bit of housekeeping. You can please submit any questions you have throughout the broadcast using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll get to as many as we can before our hour is up today. I also want to let you know that our webinar today will be recorded, and you'll be able to access that later on online this afternoon. So to tell you a little bit about our presenter, Cheryl Axelrod is an attorney, law firm owner, internationally published author, public speaker, and diversity thought leader. As an attorney, she provides strategic, results-driven advice and representation to companies concerning their commercial, employment, bodily injury, and appellate litigation matters. She was rated one of the top 50 women super lawyers in Pennsylvania for the past 3 years in a row. She's also been interviewed by radio hosts on women and diversity issues, and was recognized as a women worth watching by Profiles in Diversity Journal. She's an immediate past president of the Temple Law Alumni Association, and she's the fourth female to hold that post in Temple's nearly 100-year history. During her presidency, she founded the Temple Law Alumni Association's Women's Initiative and Diversity Committee, and many other accolades. She's written extensively on diversity and inclusion for the American Bar Association, the Minority Corporate Counsel Association, and the National Association of Women Lawyers, among other publishers. And so, Cheryl, we are so excited to have you here today. I know you have a lot to speak with us about, so very excited to get started.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for participating in this webinar with me. We're hoping it will be interactive. So please feel free to send in your questions. I look forward to addressing them. So I'm going to get started and discuss the topic that we have here today, diversity and inclusion, the least expensive formula to multiply profits. First, just as a matter of housekeeping, can I get control of the screens so that I can move the PowerPoint forward?
Yes, so do you want to move to the video now or not just yet?
I do. Actually, let's do the video first. So just so the audience understands, we're going to be showing you a video, and the reason I'm showing it to you is to try to start right off the bat with giving everyone some understanding about why inequality is so important and how deeply ingrained it is. It is so deeply ingrained in our DNA that even our marsupial genetic cousins, monkeys, understand it, and they demand, as you'll see, very much the equivalent of equal pay. So if you could show the short clip, and I just want to tell the audience we got all rights to do this in advance. I would appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, here you go.
And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
Okay, back to you, Cheryl.
Okay, so if I could have the screen. The crowd is laughing, but obviously what we're talking about is very, very serious, and it's about pay inequity and how it makes people feel. No one wants to be unfairly and unequally paid. So that was the point I was trying to get across in the video, and how deeply ingrained this is in us, and how difficult it is, the great anger that you create and resentment you create when you have inequity, two groups doing the same thing and one group getting better paid for it. So this is going to be, I have an agenda I'm showing you to kind of give you a lay of the land about what I'm going to be discussing over the course of this hour. So the first part I'm going to go through is an introduction, and I'm going to talk about why women and minorities are so disenfranchised in the workplace. And we're going to talk about unconscious bias and confirmation bias. Many people have heard of the term unconscious bias, far less have heard about confirmation bias. But for anybody who hasn't heard of either one, I'm going to talk about them, define them, and discuss in regular, plain English that everyone can understand what the studies are showing us about these things. Then I'm going to talk about the scope of the damage. It's always important to me to discuss first why we are disenfranchised, and then talk about our actual disenfranchisement. So this second part I'm going to talk about is just how disenfranchised women and minorities actually are. And I think you're going to find this really eye-opening. It's really bad, and you will see that. I'll talk about how deeply we are disenfranchised across our government, across corporations, and across the courts. There are other areas I could cover, but I figured these were major areas. The third section that I'm going to be covering is turning a page and looking at things in a much more positive light. And I'm going to talk in this third part about the profitability of diversity, which is the title of this presentation. And I look at it as an absolutely extraordinary opportunity. If we actually turned a page and we treated everybody far more equally, what would happen? And I looked at that question and examined it, and I went through many studies and found this incredible answer that not only was there a positive impact, which I knew that there had to be, but in fact, there's a synergistic positive impact. And for those who don't know what that word is, don't worry, because I'm going to define that too and talk about it. And I'm going to not only talk about the positive impact and the just extraordinary positive impact, but also how it is that that impact occurs, how it is that diversity is so incredibly profitable, how and why. And then in the last part, what I'm going to do is leave you with concrete tips that you can actually use in your businesses and in your day-to-day interactions to be more inclusive and create the kind of world I'd like to see where we are far more diverse and far more inclusive from top to bottom, not just at the bottom of our organizations. And for those who work in nonprofits, whether full-time or part-time or as a hobby or as a job, this information, and I'm going to talk about that, in fact, positively impacts nonprofits too, and I'll talk about why. So this is the agenda for our discussion today. So I'm going to move to number 1 on our agenda, why women and minorities are so disenfranchised. So I said I would talk about unconscious bias and confirmation bias, and what are these things? So defining unconscious bias means looking at preconceived ideas and stereotypes. That's what unconscious bias is. So unconscious means you're not aware of it, and a bias means you're treating people differently. So you're treating people differently, and you're unaware that you're doing it, and you're doing it based on preconceived ideas and stereotypes that you have about them that you're not even aware that you have. So women and minorities suffer from unconscious bias. Confirmation bias is something related to it, but a little different. It's about confirming your preconceived ideas, and I'm going to talk about studies that show and exemplify this term, what it means and what's happening. But they come from the disenfranchisement of women and minorities. So to set the stage, and I'm going to talk about that last piece, they come from the disenfranchisement of women and minorities. So you're going to see when I talk about how greatly disenfranchised we are, that women and minorities find themselves few and far between at the top of almost any ladder that you climb. So whether you talk about our government, whether you talk about corporations, whether you talk about the courts, whether you talk about educational, in educational institutions, many other arenas, they're very few and far between. So we've grown up in a world where when we turned on the television, when we read a newspaper, when we went to a company, when we went to the doctor's office, the lawyer's office, etc., overwhelmingly we were seeing white, seemingly at least non-diverse men at the top. And so we unconsciously came to think about doctors and lawyers and engineers and judges and presidents and congresspeople as white men. And that impacted how we viewed women and minorities. We did not expect them to be leaders. We did not expect them to be presidents. We didn't expect them to be congresspeople. We didn't expect them to be our bosses. And so that's really what that's about. I recently saw a presentation about lawyers and how we have been shown in the media through the decades. And it was stunning to me how long it took for us to see women in the courtroom as lawyers, minorities in the courtroom as lawyers, and women who are minorities in the courtroom as lawyers, or as judges, or as heads of state, any such thing. So this presentation about lawyers showed that women and minorities were portrayed initially as file clerks, as paralegals, as ditzy administrative assistants, versus, very bright and capable administrative assistants. And the main figurehead was the white male, and this happened over decades before we got anywhere close to looking like the leaders in the courtroom. So that is how these things came to be. So going to the next slide, why we are so disenfranchised, what the result of that is. I write here, we prefer not just men, but tall white men. So what do I mean by that? There's actually a book called Blink, and in Blink, there is a discussion of who we prefer, and we're looking at CEOs. And it turns out that 58% of Fortune 500 CEOs are not just white and not just male, but 6 foot tall or taller. That is an enormous amount of men, white men, to be CEOs. In the United States, just to put this into context, only about 14.5% of men are 6 foot tall or taller. And yet we have 58% of our Fortune 500 CEOs. So what is happening? What is happening is that we already preconceived, we have this preconceived idea, this stereotype, that leaders look like that. They look tall, they look white, and they look male. And so unconsciously, we put them into leadership positions like CEO positions. If anybody were to argue that being white, being a man, or being 6 foot tall or taller makes somebody better qualified to be a CEO, I would say we would all know that that was just completely irrational. So it is not rational thought that is leading to this. It is unconscious thought that creates the environment in which this kind of thing happens. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is another example of our unconscious bias at play. So there was a study done, a very interesting study, and rather than giving you a 50-page analysis of the study, I'm culling it down again, putting it into plain English. It was about lab managers, and there was a study where scientists were given applications that were identical. The only difference on the application for this male lab manager position was that some of the applications had male names on them. Some of them had female names on them, but otherwise they were entirely identical. So we're looking at the exact same resumes, the exact same cover letters, one with a male name, one with female name. So they gave them to scientists, and they asked the scientists to rate the competency of the applicants and how much they would pay them. And they were asked who deserved to be mentored. And stunningly, what they found was that when you look at this, the male name, that person was going to get hired. By those who would even hire the woman, she was going to get a $4,500 difference, a lower paid position than the male. And the male was deemed more worthy of spending time mentoring. So essentially what happened was 60 scientists were given these applications, 30 the woman and 30 the man. And the male applicant, again, he was rated more competent, more likely to be hired, and he would have been offered $4,500 more to start with. Again, all things being absolutely identical, and you can't, from this study, you cannot even argue that the woman didn't present as well as the man because there was no interview or any photo, nothing that involved actually seeing these people, these applicants. What's important to note also in this, and you see it at the bottom, female scientists were as likely as male scientists to evaluate the students this way. So in other words, the applicants, they were students that were applying to be the lab managers, both female scientists and male scientists equally thought of the male as more competent, more likely to be hired, deserving of better salary, and more worthy of mentoring. Why is that? Go back to what I started with when I talked about that we all grew up in a world in which everyone we were seeing at the top, virtually everyone we were seeing at the top, was a white, seemingly non-diverse male. So that seeped into our consciousness. It led us to subconsciously start creating assumptions about who leaders are, who make good leaders, etc. And so both men and women equally share, unfortunately, this unconscious bias against women and minorities in the workplace. So going to the next slide, here I'm going to talk about orchestra auditions, venture capital, and confirmation bias. So some more examples just to kind of prove my point that unconscious bias exists, it can be quantified, and it appears in both men and women as a result of the way that we have seen the world. When orchestra auditions were done all the way up to about 30 years ago, what happened, sorry, more than 30 years ago, I guess it's 45 years ago, 1970, what we saw was that the orchestras were overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. And certainly part of that is because of the great inequity we have in our country in terms of classes. The poor people in this country tend to be people of color. The wealthier people tend to be white, and we have a huge amount of bias that leads to that, not to mention slavery. There's so many reasons behind this. But there is a certain amount of money that you're going to have to even get to the point where you're going to apply to work in an orchestra, and you have to own this piece of equipment, and lots of these instruments are extremely expensive. But when we started the orchestra auditions before 1970, you would see the person that was applying for the job, and they would play, and we were finding a lot of white non-diverse men getting the seats, overwhelmingly so. So in 1970, they started to try blind auditions, and that meant people would audition behind a screen. And what they found when they auditioned behind a screen was that the number of women and minorities that got positions really went up. So we have the data about the amount of women that went up, and it was very high, as you see here. So it's made a very big positive difference, and now they tell people to take their shoes off and such, so you can't hear the women's heels clicking as they go across, because that's also been determined to make a difference. So these blind auditions have really helped. That's, again, unconscious bias. It has to be, right? Because the only difference is that there's no difference in the quality of their playing, but you have the visible versus the invisible gender with one and the other. With venture capital, the same thing is going on. And what we find is that when you have women or minorities make the same identical pitch as white men, you find that the white men overwhelmingly get the venture capital money. And since most of the time the people pitching for venture capital money are actually seen by the people that are giving them the money, we find that only 4% of venture capital goes to women, and I suspect the numbers are very low for minorities as well. So confirmation bias. I'm going to just quickly discuss this study and try to show you what it means through the study. So this is a study of racial bias, and it's called Written in Black and White. It's a great title for it. And it's Dr. Aaron Reeves that did this study. Nexcon is the company. And by the way, at the very end of this presentation, the very, very end are my citations to the studies I'm mentioning and such, so you'll have that. But Dr. Aaron Reeves was looking at confirmation bias and tried to figure out a way to demonstrate it, and very effectively did. So what Dr. Reeves did was give out to 60 partners in law firms a memorandum that was allegedly written by a individual. And the truth was that this individual, who they called Thomas Mayer and said was a third-year associate who had graduated from NYU, was in fact non-existent. There was no Thomas Mayer. But what they did was they had other lawyers involved in writing a memo and purposefully put into the memo some errors in legal analysis, some errors in spelling, some errors in facts. So they're doing this on purpose to try to find out what's going on. So on the cover page of the memo, half of the partners that were going to review this memo, and the partners were just told, I would like you to review Thomas Mayer's memorandum and let us know whether we should hire this attorney. So they gave half of the lawyers who were going to review Thomas Mayer's memo the cover sheet that identified him as Caucasian, and the other half, the cover sheet said that he was African American. And again, the other identifying characteristics were all the same. Thomas Mayer, third-year associate, graduated from NYU. We would like you to evaluate this memo. And they asked the partners to rate the memo from 1 was the worst to 5 was the best, and give them feedback about this individual, should they hire him. And the results that they got were just so stunning. The partners who thought they were reviewing Thomas Mayer, the African American, wrote far more negative comments about his writing than the partners who thought they were reviewing a Caucasian's work. Not only was the feedback far more negative, and I mean to the point where there were partners who would write on the memo, I can't believe he graduated from NYU. There were negative scores that were given to the quote-unquote African-American Thomas Mayer, so the scores were far lower. He got a 4 point, no, he got a 3.2 out of 5. The white, the Caucasian Thomas Mayer got a 4.1 out of 5 for the exact same writing assignment. And what's even more striking about this is that the African American Thomas Mayer, more errors were found in what he wrote. So that is confirmation bias. That piece, the greater amount of errors, is confirmation bias. Well, what do I mean? What I mean is that if you already have a preconceived idea about a group of people, like let's say African Americans, and the preconceived idea is they don't write as well, or they're not as smart, or something along those lines as Caucasians, then when you read this memo, you may look harder for evidence that will confirm your bias. And that's what these partners were unconsciously doing, at least a number of them. They looked harder to find errors in his work, and they did. The people that reviewed Thomas Mayer, the African American, found far more errors in his work than the people that reviewed the Thomas Mayer that was allegedly Caucasian. So that is what confirmation bias is. Now, I set out the lay of the land in terms of why there is unconscious bias against women and minorities, why there is our great disenfranchisement across the country and actually across the globe. And now I'm going to talk about how bad it is. Again, we're going to turn a page and talk about the profitability of diversity, but I need to talk about the importance of that, and this really underscores the importance of it. So how disenfranchised are we? Well, let's start with our presidents. We've never had a woman president, and there are many, many, many countries across the globe that have. We have had one president of color, Barack Obama. So if things were equal, since we've had 43 presidents, we would have had at least 21 that were women, and since minorities are about 14% of that's people of color. If I would add, I would love to add other minorities, but we don't really have great data about a lot of them, like LGBTs, for instance. We don't have great data about how many people are. That's a complex issue that we as a society are just starting to grapple with. We need to create a more inclusive environment so people feel comfortable coming out as LGBT and answering surveys and such, saying that they are. But we know about 14% of the country are of color, and it's growing, and we're going to be more than half people of color, I believe, by 2040. So we would see a lot more presence of color if we were equal than we've had to date. And across, here we go, we have 17% Hispanic and Latino population. They're the largest majority. I'm sorry, it wasn't 14%, it's 13.2% of the country's African American. So actually, if we add them together, we're at 30% people of color. So we would see a lot more. We should have seen at least 4 African American presidents and at least 1 Latino president if things were equal. Moving on, our cabinet, the President Obama's cabinet. We only have 3 women out of 16 that are on the cabinet, so that means instead of having 8, we only have 3. We're almost at half as many women as should be on the cabinet are. For people of color, I wrote pretty good. We have Eric Holder as the Attorney General, Susan Rice, and you can see the other names that I put, and I go through who's Hispanic on there as well. In our Congress, you can quickly see what it looks like by gender. This is the 114th Congress. You see how much is blue. That's how many male Congress people we have. The orangish pink is the coral color, I guess, is female. So 80% male, 20% female. I'm sorry, 19% female in the House, 80% male, 20% female in the Senate. You know, very poor numbers, considering women are about 50% of the population. And then when you look at the racial composition of the Congress, it's also extremely poor. So you can see overwhelmingly almost 80% white for the House, and even greater disenfranchisement in the Senate, where we have 94% white. So the people that are governing us are overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. When we look across our companies, we only have 50 women CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies. Obviously, if we were at equal, we would be at about 250 rather than 50. So instead of at 10%, we would be at 50%. These numbers from Fortune, they reported in 2014 that we had just over 4% of the Fortune 500 CEOs were minorities, and that included African Americans, Asians, and Latinos, Latin Americans, and just 6 African American CEOs, 10 Hispanic CEOs. So, you know, we have 4.8%, if you look at this bottom part, women among all the CEOs as of 2014, and overwhelmingly, again, we're seeing white men in CEO positions. So then I looked at when I kept looking at companies, I also wanted to see general counsel. Those are the people that head the legal departments in companies. I'm a lawyer, so I was just curious. And again, we see very few. It's 105 women GCs out of 500, better than CEOs, certainly, but we're not at the 250 we should be at. And then we see how many are diverse. And again, the diversity numbers are very poor. They're 10% of GCs of the Fortune 500. And we see 25% are African American, 12%, 2%, 12 in number, 2% are Asian, and only 2% Hispanic, just not at all reflective of the population at large. Our Supreme Court is largely white and male. We're up to the greatest concentration of women on the Supreme Court we've ever had, and that means 3 out of 9. It's only a third. And we have 1 African American and 1 Latino. We have no Asians or any other diversity that I'm aware of on the bench, or that anybody I think is aware of on the bench. So now let's turn a page and get to, I'm about halfway through the presentation, and I can get to the exciting news. The profitability of diversity, which is an incredible opportunity. Let's turn a page and see what would happen. This is the question that I wanted to answer when I started publishing in this space. What would happen if women and minorities were better included at the top? And what I found was absolutely striking. So much so that when I submitted my first article for publication in the Pennsylvania Lawyer, that's a magazine that goes to 28,000 lawyers across the state of Pennsylvania. It's the first article I ever submitted to that magazine, and it made the cover page because it was a cover story, because it was so stunning, the news, that more women and minorities in leadership equates with far greater financial success, and diversity creates a synergistic positive impact. So what's synergistic? I promised I would define it, so I will. So synergistic means that when you add one impact and another impact, the combined impact is not the same as just adding the impact from the one and the impact of the other. So an example I can give you from my background, I'm a trial lawyer, and when I was a junior lawyer, one of the things I did was asbestos litigation. And asbestos is a dust that is very harmful. And a certain amount of people that work around asbestos will get lung cancer. Now, a certain amount of people that smoke will get lung cancer too. If you just smoke, your likelihood of getting lung cancer is, let's say, X. And if you just work around asbestos, your likelihood of getting lung cancer is Y. Okay, just making up a number. Put whatever you want for X, put whatever you want for Y. But I'll tell you that if you smoke and work around asbestos, your chance of getting lung cancer is much bigger than X plus Y. There is a synergistic positive impact. There's a multiplier effect from the two, that they combine forces, in that case in a very negative way, to raise the rate, raise the chance that you'll get cancer. Diversity has a very positive impact. It's so impactful that the impact is not just the difference between adding one woman plus separately and then adding one minority, for instance, separately, and putting those, adding the two positive impacts together. No, there's actually a multiplier impact that happens from this. And that's what's so exciting. And it's not just good for business, it benefits the entire country. And I'm going to show you that in a graphic that really makes it very clear. And the graphic will also show that countries that more equally pay women are far more globally competitive. So this is what shows you that. This is a graph, and I got all the rights to show this. This shows the relationship between global competitiveness and equal pay. So this is among women. I have no doubt the same thing would be true among minorities because it's the same issues at play, the same factors at play. So if you look along this left-hand side, this is our global competitiveness, the global competitiveness, of countries, one to another. I'm going to move, I guess I have to move back, sorry. Let me get back to this. Here we go. The global competitiveness of countries. This is how equally they pay women and men. Now you'll notice it only goes out to 0.9. It should go out to 1.0, right? Yes, but there isn't a country in the world, unfortunately, that pays women dollar for dollar what it pays men. So that's why we don't go out that far. But what's very striking to see in this graph is this. And this line is showing that the more you equally pay the sexes down here, the more you equally pay them, the greater your competitiveness as a country. So what does that mean? The more money the country makes, the better it does. And it's per capita. So that means per person. So that's why when you look at Iceland and Norway and Sweden, these countries that are at the very top of this curve, in other words, most equally paying women and men, they are not the giant superpowers. Why are they not? Because it's per capita, per person, and Sweden, Norway, and Iceland are very tiny countries with very small populations. So while each person in the country is doing far better relative to people around the rest of the world, they're not going to be an economic superpower tomorrow because they're just so much smaller than us. We have so many more people. So we just dwarf them in terms of our numbers, and therefore our dollars at the end of the day and revenues are higher. But if you look here, this is where the United States is. And by the way, if we filled this in according to the Global Gender Gap Report, I think we are 67 in the world. I think we actually moved up now to 66 in the world, but behind 65 other countries that more equally pay women and men. We could be way out here if we started to pay women. You see the scale again. If we, instead of paying women, let's say 76 cents or 78 cents to every dollar men do, if we suddenly started to pay them more like 99, 100, a dollar for every dollar men make, we would be way out here, and it would make a huge positive impact. We would make so much more money, and there's other ways in which it would help us. So I'm going to go, before I go to this slide, I want to go back a little bit and talk about how much having women and minorities at the top pays. So just to get a grip and a handle around it, companies in which women and minorities are more equally represented at the top, their profits go up 64 to 84%. I mean, those numbers are enormous. They're just huge. That's the kind of doing better I'm talking about. And I said it was a synergistic positive impact. That's what I mean when you get to numbers like this. Now, more racially diverse companies, those companies bring in 15 times the revenues. I'll say that again, 15 times the revenues of less racially diverse companies. So the economic impact of diversity is sky high. It's this synergistic positive impact that you see. And now when we go, I'm going to advance a little bit, we're going to talk about why. This slide is speaking to that. So why do organizations do so much better? And you know what, let me just add one more thing before I get there, because I see I have the time to do it, which is nice. When we looked at, and I did look at studies of the Fortune 500 companies, and I mentioned them earlier. If anybody doesn't know what they are, I should just define it. The Fortune 500 companies are the most successful companies in the country. And if you look at the Fortune 500 in the world, you could do that too, but we're looking at the Fortune 500 in this country. So that means the companies that have the greatest revenues of all. And when you look among them, they're called the Fortune 500 because they're the top 500. And when you look among them, the Fortune 100s are the most successful companies. Okay, the Fortune 200s are slightly less successful. When you look at the Fortune 300s, they are slightly less successful than that. So that's how it works. It goes down the scale from there. The positive impact of diversity is so great that when you look at the Fortune 100s, I know this is with women, they don't have this data, I wasn't able to find it for racial minorities, but I could find it for women. I have no doubt the same thing is going to happen when you talk about racial diversity and other forms of diversity. When you look at the Fortune 100s, they have the greatest concentration of women at the top. When you look at the Fortune 200s, there's a little less. When you look at the Fortune 300s, there's a little less, and so on down to the Fortune 500s. In other words, there is a direct correlation between the amount of women at the top and the amount of success of a company. And again, just to repeat, 15 times the revenues when you have a racially more diverse company, 15 times the revenues. So we're seeing in both. So when we go back to this graph, which is, I think, no, two back. Okay, when we go here, that's the reason I know that if you were to move the United States out, meaning have us pay women more equally and have us pay minorities more equally and better include us throughout the chain from top to bottom, that we would be far more globally competitive. Our companies would make lots more money, and as a result, when you multiply that out over all the companies doing this, the country itself would be far more globally economically competitive. Our GNP, gross national product, would be far higher. We would be doing far better. And this is not a quote. This is me paraphrasing, but I am paraphrasing John Acre, who is someone else in this space who's also looking at what the positive impact, what impacts occur with greater equality. And what he found was, and again, I'm paraphrasing it, but if we paid women and minorities more equally, the profits of our companies would skyrocket. And this is what John adds to the picture, this is what he examines. He looked at our global economic competitiveness, and he looked at how would we as a country change fundamentally, how would we as people change? And what he's finding is our educational system would improve, there would be less corruption, and we would become happier as a society. And he actually looked at studies, and they show this, that with greater inclusion of women and minorities in the country are these huge positive impacts. And if you think back to the video we saw when I first started this presentation, it makes sense, doesn't it? Because it's a frustrating thing to not be treated equally. Anyone who has ever experienced inequality in their life didn't like it, I'm sure. We would be far happier. And I have no doubt our educational system would be better, and our corruption would go down. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, these positive impacts and spread it even further. I've been looking at women and minorities because that, as I explained, is the data that you can actually find. It's very much more difficult to get data outside of that. Although I've been doing so, I've been starting to, there have been studies and I've been putting them together that start to examine this issue from perspective of other minorities. So, for instance, LGBTs, and there are now studies showing that, for instance, countries that better include LGBTs, for instance, have any two adults that wish to marry may marry, that, for instance, do not allow discrimination in the workplace against LGBTs. Those kinds of countries, they find that they do better. They actually perform better. They actually make more money because they're better including all of their people. So these things have a much greater positive impact. They impact our profits. They impact how much we actually, how well we can live as a society, and they make us, happier. Okay, so how can we be more inclusive? How can we create the kind of world that would be so great to live in for everyone? First thing I think is really important is to just test your own unconscious bias. I'm going to warn you in advance. You may be horrified at the result. I would expect everyone to test for some unconscious bias. If you can go and Google Harvard implicit, Project Implicit, and you will find a whole host of tests, a real variety of tests on unconscious bias. So you can test whether you have racial bias, whether you have gender bias, bias against LGBTs, people who are disabled, all sorts of things. And I pretty much guarantee you're going to have some bias in probably all of these areas. So it's important to just take the test and check in and just see for yourself that you do have it. We all do, because we all grew up in this world I described. Men and women, people of color and white people, people that are LGBTs, all of us, we have this. So the other thing I want to make very clear is that knowing that you have it is step one, but I want to make very, very clear to everyone that virtually no one wants to have it. Yes, there are some people, like people that may be members of the Ku Klux Klan and the like, that actually are, what is the word, perhaps proud that they carry, that they are racist, sexist, discriminatory in every sense and in every way. But the vast majority of people, I would assert, don't want to treat white men better than everybody else. They don't want to give them a leg up. They don't want to treat women and minorities worse just because they're women or minorities. Most of us want to treat everybody fairly and equally. Look, I've spent my, gazillions of hours looking into this, and I certainly don't want to treat anybody unequally. So knowing you have this unconscious bias and knowing that virtually no one wants to have it actually has a positive impact, and it does oftentimes make people check themselves, check their behavior, and ask themselves, and this is a really important question to ask yourself and to do it on a constant basis. Would you say the same thing to a white man that you just said to a woman or minority? Would you react in the same way to a white man that you just reacted to a woman or minority? When you check in and ask those kinds of questions, people that do a far better job of treating everybody equally. So it's a very important thing to do. It's a great important exercise. So that's number one tip to increase your inclusion. Three tips. One, find out the level of your unconscious bias. Just check in and see that you have it. Number two, remind yourself that hopefully you really don't want to have this. And then start asking yourself in your interactions whether you'd react, say the same thing to a white man that you would just think, even before you talk, you might even think about it, and then you can check yourself from doing it. So what are other things that we can do? Well, anybody who has any control over hiring, promotions, assignments, networking opportunities, and pay can take measures to minimize unconscious bias. And the key word here is right there, audit. Audit your hiring, your promotions, your assignments, your networking opportunities, and pay. Figure out who is getting hired, who is getting promoted, who is getting and by assignments, I'm really looking at the plum assignments, the really good assignments. Who's getting the best assignments? Who is getting the networking opportunities, and who is getting the best pay? And by networking, include the ability to interact with the people at the top of the company. You want to make sure women and minorities get fairly and equally represented in all of these areas. So if half the population's women, we should be seeing them getting hired, promoted, given the plum assignments, networking opportunities, and pay in equal amounts. Now, if you come back to me and you say, well, yes, but only 30% of the people in my company are women, the first thought I have is, why is that? And are there measures that you should be taking so it's more equal? But, check in with, are you at least at 30% in terms of 30% of the people are getting these promotions and assignments and networking opportunities and pay? Okay. Now, these are other measures that everyone can take to minimize their bias, whether they have these controls that I just mentioned, the ability to hire, pay, etc., or not. So number one, delay making key decisions about people until you have the time to challenge them. That's the check-in. So when you're looking at somebody for anything, ask yourself, is the person you're considering the best fit for the job, the assignment, whatever you have in front of you? Because we default to white men. We almost always do. This is an example. You're going to hire a court reporter. You're going to hire a vendor. You're going to buy paper, etc. You pick up your phone, and most of the time you're going to call a white man to do the job. Check yourself. Is there someone who's equally or more qualified, who's a minority or a woman or both, that you should be calling? Okay. Don't make key decisions when you're tired, stressed, or emotionally drained, because then what are you going to do? Default to making the decision in favor, generally, of a white, non-diverse male. And maybe that person is the best person for whatever you're thinking about, but maybe not. And it's better to do the first thing, delay making that decision until you've had the ability to check in. So don't do it when you're tired or stressed or you're emotionally drained or you're coming up on a deadline. Not a good time. Try to avoid those key decisions until you've got time to really think them through. And that's good in any business environment. Also, do that check-in. Try justifying to yourself in a mirror that this person you're thinking of for whatever assignment, opportunity, etc., is the best person for it, and that other candidates are not actually the best people for it. Try to making sure you can really justify that. Okay. When you take your unconscious bias test, don't beat yourself up over the fact that, yes, indeed, you have some bias. As I said, we all do. But do make the check and remind yourself that you don't want to have this bias. You do want to actually take steps to try to minimize it. Also, get to know people who you perceive to be different. Certainly look for people who have different backgrounds and bring different perspectives. My friends are a very diverse and inclusive group of people. My Rolodex is full of women and men, people of color and white people, people that are LGBTs and people who are not. You want to get to a place where yours is as well. And I mean in your work and in your home life. And I can tell you that the profitability of diversity, the reason it works so well is the same reason it's going to enhance your life to have a group of people around you that doesn't all look like you. So I'm going to explain it very quickly, but it goes to the issue of how it is that diversity has this enormous impact. And the reason I knew diversity would have a positive impact, I didn't know it would have a synergistic positive impact. That was an incredibly fun, amazing, enlightening, and just terrifically happy moment. But I knew it was going to have a positive impact, and here's why. I was an economics major at Brandeis, and everything I've looked at in my life has come through this lens of an economics background, which I never thought I would use when I went to law school. I thought it would all, disappear, and it's kind of neat that this great education I got is with me, and I use it every day. Well, what I envisioned was a board of directors, and let's say it was 20 people large, and suppose you sat people exactly like me all around the seats. Every seat of the 20 seats had a Cheryl in it. So somebody who, I'm 47, somebody who was 47, who was white, who was heterosexual, who was Jewish, who grew up in a socioeconomic background like I did, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with that board of directors, 20 people strong, is, I may be reasonably intelligent, I kind of hope I am, but I've got a limited perspective. There's a million things I didn't grow up with that other people did. So if we took half of the people just like me and asked them to go home, and we put, just for instance, men in their seats. So now we have 10 women like me and 10 men. We've increased the diversity a lot of this group, because I didn't grow up a man, so I've got a whole different perspective now at the table. And if we kept changing the table and we said, okay, now we've got 10 women, 10 men, but we're going to take half the table and ask them to go home, because so far, let's say that the whole table's white, and we're going to take half this table and, or let's say a third of the table, and have people of color, LGBT, somebody who's disabled, and let's say we we said to somebody, okay, you go home, I'd like somebody from Afghanistan to sit at this table. The more that we increase the diversity of the table, the greater the perspective is going to grow. And the more opportunities we're going to be able to identify, and the more threats we'll be able to avoid. And the better we're going to function as a result. That's why nonprofits benefit from diversity too, not just for-profit companies, because diversity brings this incredibly beautiful wealth of perspective that you just don't get from a homogenous group. Okay, last tips are the ones that I designed. It's a tool that I created that everyone can use back home in your day-to-day interactions. The Place, Echo, and Promote tool. So what does it mean? These are 3 things I would ask you to try to do. One is place. Placement is about recommending people for opportunities. So if you see a great opportunity and you know of a great woman or minority or both that would be a perfect fit for this opportunity, like a publication, like a speaking engagement, like a job, like a certain career, place them by recommending them for the opportunities. And when I say recommend them, I mean tell the people that are offering the opportunity that you know somebody great for it, and tell them who it is, and then go back to the woman or minority and recommend that they apply for it. Now, if you feel like doing it in the reverse way, that's fine too. But my point is hit both. Talk to the woman or minority or both about it, and talk to the people that are offering the opportunity, and try to place them, try to get them that opportunity so that there's greater equality in this country. Echoing is about the issue of visibility. When we live in a world as we do, of great disenfranchisement of women and minorities, we don't get heard. Women and minorities don't get heard half as well as white men. This leads to such things as group settings in which a woman or minority makes a suggestion, and I'm sure that many of you have experienced this. In fact, can we do the poll?
Yes, absolutely.
Can we do the poll for the
So here
for this?
we're gonna.
Because I want to just see what the audience said.
Sure. So we're going to launch a quick poll. So if you can just respond to a series of questions that are going to be popping up on your screen. So the first is, have you ever made a really good suggestion in a group setting that people ignored? Whether this was a personal setting or a work setting. Again, we'll give you a few more seconds just to weigh in, and then we'll share the results and another quick question with you. So a couple more seconds to weigh in. And we're going to share the results, and I think you'll see this is pretty telling. So 94% of you on the call today said, yes, this has happened to you, and you're either a woman or a minority. And the other 6%, yes, and you're neither a woman nor a minority. So 100% of folks on the call experienced this.
Okay, so, and very, very telling that the bulk of the women and minorities had this happen to them. That there's so many women and minorities who had this happen to them. So there's a visibility problem here. So what can we do to correct for it? You can echo. And what does that mean? So suppose a woman or minority made a great idea in a group setting. They said something that was really fabulous. Assume that the group didn't hear it, because that's probably the case, and echo it. So say the woman or minority's name. Say, you know, Latoya Jones made a fabulous comment. Then repeat exactly what she said, or you know, words to that effect. So Latoya was saying that we should, you know, whatever Latoya said, and then wrap it up with something like, you know, and I think that's a really terrific idea because blah blah blah. So this way, you have given her, or the woman or the minority, the credit that was due. You're not taking it as your own idea, which very often happens to all of us, and you're raising the person's profile. So this is really critically important. So to the extent you can echo women and minorities in group settings, I would really ask you to do that. That can be very helpful. The last tool is promotion. So it's place, echo, promote. Promote is to speak highly of the women and minorities that you know that are very capable and very talented. Just tell people how terrifically well you think of them. And when I mean people, I mean the people that could promote them, the people that could place them into great opportunities, etc. So you want to speak highly of them, especially among the people that can positively impact their careers. years. Okay, so one other thing that we can do to help women and minorities achieve equality is support women and minority-owned businesses. I don't know if the audience knows, but we have a stunning amount of these businesses that are popping up. There's about, Amex is estimating that we have 1,200 new women-owned businesses launching a day in this country. That's a huge, huge, huge number. Minority-owned businesses growing at a huge rate as well. And by the way, as I said, we're going to be at, a majority of people of color in this country versus white country. I think it's by 2040. And so minority-owned businesses are launching at a great rate. So there's a lot of positive change happening, and I think we're going to see a great increase in the rate of equality. I think our Congress is going to radically change in, I would say, the next 25 to 30 years. So we're going to see some really great changes happen. But while we're on our path there, please make sure to support the women and minority-owned businesses. Many businesses like mine's a three-attorney law firm, an office manager, and I went into business on my own in part because of this disenfranchisement. I worked at large law firms. I didn't find them to be as diverse and inclusive as smaller firms, and I'm talking about in general. Large law firms in general are not as much, and I thought a smaller environment that I owned would be far more inclusive, and certainly my goal is to be and to continue to maintain a diverse and inclusive environment. And we're actually looking to hire somebody now, and so I've been consciously making sure that I'm putting the opportunity out, not just in places that a lot of white people will see, but in places that minorities will see as well. And certainly we're open to a woman or a man getting the position. It should be the most qualified person who should get the job. All right. Just want to, as I wrap up, thank you all for attending this conference, this webinar. I very much appreciate it. Thank you for participating in the poll. It's very enlightening. I want to thank Brandeis and the Hyatt Career Center for having me as a speaker. Do we have any time to take questions, and are there questions, Alexandra?
Yeah, absolutely, Cheryl. So we're getting in a few questions now. It is 1 o'clock. So for those of you who do have to duck out of the presentation now and get back to the workday, this will be recorded and available later on this afternoon. But Cheryl, if you can stick around for a few more moments and address some of the questions coming in, that would be great.
I will. And I'm going to just move this over. You have my bio in here. You'll have my contact information. If you have any questions, it's in here. There's the next steps, and here's where I said the last page was going to be, last page is going to be the citations. So you have citations to the references I'm talking about, and if I'm missing anything that I mentioned, you can always just email me and I'll get it for you. So happy to address the questions.
Wonderful. So a couple people rang in after the poll question there that 95% of the people on the call are actually women and minorities, and isn't that telling? And that's certainly kind of what we expected, though not necessarily what we had hoped, Cheryl, when we planned this. But one of the questions was, I think it's telling that the vast majority of the group on this webinar and those interested in this subject in the first place are not those that need to hear it most. The argument for strategic advantage is strong, but how do we get it heard?
It's a great question, and it's a real challenge, I'll tell you. One of the things I do is, in addition to running this law firm, I co-founded a nonprofit with Marianne Mullaney, another practicing lawyer, called the Fearless Women Network. And it's dedicated to shattering glass ceilings and obliterating unequal pay. And although the word women is in the title, you can tell from our mission it's not just about equal pay for women, it's about equal pay for everyone. And we have a hard time getting more men in the room. Now, I guess the good news is, if I put this presentation on 10 years ago, I don't think there would have been a single white, non-diverse man listening, whereas I think we had 4 or 5. So we're moving in the right direction. It's an incredibly slow ride. What we need to do to get more men in the room is we need a lot more men to be visible and promoting equality. there are some incredible leaders in this space. Thanks to every man that is listening to this. I especially thank you for joining. The men that are getting involved in this are some of our most amazing leaders. So for instance, the chairman of PwC is very active in this space. And if you go to PwC on their website, you can actually see him sitting down with Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook, and the writer of Lean In, talking to her about these issues. There are companies where men are joining He for She and writing about why it is that they're doing this. And we need a lot more men to be doing that. We need men to join us. And I think we as women should be making sure that the people that we love, our dads, our brothers, the men in our lives, the sons in our lives, that, and by men I meant either our significant other or males that we're friends with or we love and care about, and our sons, that we should make sure that we engage them in this discussion too, that we talk to them about how equality benefits both men and women and the country. I want to add a little note to that for those who are staying on. So how do men benefit from this? Well, this is just one example. I mean, if the fact that the entire country and every company will do incredibly better, far, far, far better, isn't compelling enough. How about the fact of the following? Gender stereotypes don't just negatively impact women. I'm just going to repeat that. Gender stereotypes don't just negatively impact women. They negatively impact men too. So we all know some of the ways in which gender stereotypes negatively impact women. I went through some of them. It leads to our great disenfranchisement. It leads to a lot of other things. It leads to the whole issue of women having us being bombarded with how our bodies should look. There's a great Pantene ad that I can send around to anybody who wants it that speaks to gender stereotypes and how they negatively impact us day to day. But they negatively impact men too. So here's an example. Men are less likely to seek counseling, emotional counseling. They are less likely than women because men may perceive counseling not to be masculine. And words like, oh, it's for wusses come out. You know, it's for unmanly men, whatever that means. And in fact, more men will commit suicide as a result of going through depression than they would if they would just seek counseling. So this is a very, very serious way in which negative stereotypes, gender stereotypes, impact men. There are other ways. We live in a society where generally men believe that they need to financially take care of their household. And that adds emotional stress and pressure to them. If we lived in a more equal world, both partners would view making money as a shared and equal responsibility in the home. And that's, you know, putting to the side for a moment the issue of when the woman has a baby. Obviously, she's the one who carries it and has the baby and needs to recover and spend time with the child at the beginning. But outside of those moments, and I'm talking about in heterosexual couples, that, you know, there'd be less pressure upon men to feel that they have to be the ones who support financially their households. So these are just two, but they're big ones, two ways in which gender stereotypes negatively impact men. There are many more. I'll give just one more to throw it out there. Suppose you're a boy growing up and you are not muscular and you're a terrible athlete. I mean, I have no doubt that it's going to be a much harder experience that you're going to go through as a kid. And add to that, if you're an LGBT and or perceived to be quote-unquote feminine, it's a much more difficult road that you're going to have emotionally than a man that grows up with lots of muscles and a really great athlete and is perceived by others to be manly, whatever that means. So gender stereotypes are very entrenched, and they impact both sexes in very severely negative ways. So there is a reason for men to get engaged here. not just to help women and minorities, but also to better their own lives. And if men want the chance to take time and raise their children to the same degree that women have the opportunity to do so, like right now in society, it's considered that women should be the one taking time off work and raising children and being the primary caretakers. But there are men that would like to do that. And if we live in a world where we're more equal, men will be equally able to do these things and not feel that their masculinity is threatened by other men.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. We have just 2 more questions, and then someone else's hand is raised, so I'm going to try to get to them in the next 5 minutes or so.
Okay, I'll try to speed up my answer. Sorry.
No worries. This is great. The next question is, what do you recommend to strengthen the partnership between diversity and inclusion and EEO/affirmative action compliance?
To strengthen the bonds between them. Well, how do I say this in a quick answer? First, the term affirmative action I like to always explain to me is not about giving anybody special favors. It is about creating a more equal world. And affirmative measures are absolutely fundamentally critical to reaching a more equal world. So how do we strengthen that tie? My answer to that is raising awareness. And this is why I put on the presentations I do, publish the articles I do, etc. If we are better able to raise awareness about the great disenfranchisement of women and minorities, hopefully we can make people better understand that these affirmative measures are absolutely critical to us to be able as a society to get to a greater measure of equality and to then glean the enormous benefits of it that I went through in the presentation and become more globally competitive, happier, have a better educational system and less corruption.
Great. Thank you. We have an interesting question here from one of our male listeners. What are the limits of increasing diversity? So this listener grew up in a small community that was dysfunctional in many ways, largely because, in his opinion, it was so exceedingly diverse that people lacked common cultural language. Really interesting question. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, okay, to me the question is really not about dysfunction so much as how do you make things more harmonious. Which is, I guess, a positive spin on the word dysfunction. But I look at it this way, that great diversity has great benefits. And there are, nothing comes without a price, and nothing is perfect in this world. So with greater diversity, there can be greater disharmony, greater dysfunction, because as the writer wrote, people may not understand each other as well. But if you ask me, the solution to that is not to get more homogenous, not to get everybody to look more alike and act more alike and sound more alike, because then we're back to the land in which we have a very narrow perspective and we're missing so much and we're not half as competitive, etc. The solution there is to better engage and more engage with people that are different so that you learn their language. You learn their social cues, you learn what matters to them, and you all better understand each other. And this is a two-way thing or multi-way thing in which white, non-diverse men absolutely should be at the table and part of the conversation. As I said, I would love them to be a part of he for she, love them to get engaged in these topics. So I'm a woman, I want to always engage with men as well. For instance, my fiance, and I also have 6 brothers, etc. But we want to try to understand how men view situations differently than women. I, as a white person, make a conscious effort to, I am a member, for instance, of Barristers, which is a legal organization dedicated to the advancement of people of color, of African American lawyers. I think I'm the only non-African American that's in this group. but I think it's very important, and I would actually like to see more white people in the group. But the answer, I think, is better engagement.
Great, thank you.
Is there
And
one
so
more raised hand?
yeah, it looks like we have one raised hand from Lisa. So Lisa, I'm gonna go ahead and turn your mic on so that you can ask your question, and we'll see how this works. So Lisa, you're up. Lisa, are you still there?
Yeah, I didn't have a question. I'm not sure why I'm coming up.
Oh, okay, no worries. Thanks for joining us. Your hand was virtually raised, so I wanted to make sure I called on you.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So Cheryl, I think that we're good to go. Do you have any final thoughts before we move back to those next step slides?
No, I just wanted to go right here just for a moment. So if anybody has anything else they would want to ask or share, or just to engage further, that's my contact information. It's in your materials. Thank you again for having me speak on this topic. It was my pleasure, and I will turn it back to you.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Cheryl, for sharing all of this data with us and your recommendations for moving forward. This was really great, and we could certainly spend the rest of the day on this topic for sure. If you could flip to the next slide for me quickly, I just wanted to give you all